Hello, I'm back, and I wanted to make a video here to celebrate the fact that I've picked up one of the, say, holy grails of my collection, but something I've been looking for a long time that I finally was able to pick up and get a good deal on. That would be Famicom, we all know as the Japanese version of the NES. Came out in 1983 in Japan, and one thing I've always wondered when I first got into, retro gaming and collecting is, how did this end up like this? I mean, you figure, alright, now that there's a different size of pin connectors, the 72 and the 60, but I mean, they're the same internally. Hardware is exactly the same. Why is this like this size and this is huge? I mean, look at this thing, it's massive. I mean, we all have a Nintendo, we know what it looks like. And the truth is actually a little bit interesting. It's kind of the reason why Nintendo ended up being in the position that it was for so long, because frankly they're a smart company. Now obviously I'm a big Nintendo fanboy, and that sounds like just fanboy talk, but consider this. The Famicom came out in 1983 in Japan, and what was going on in America in 1983 was the video game crash, when Atari and Intellivision, ColecoVision, and had no quality control over their games, caused a big glut of crap basically, and stores stopped selling game systems. It was seen as a fad that came to the end of its course, and for all intents and purposes was looking like a dead-end market in America. Now Nintendo was having success in Japan with their Famicom, and they wanted to bring it to the US, but gaming and game consoles had a really negative reputation. So, what was their plan? Well, ironically, what they first were going to do was partner with Atari and have Atari basically release the Famicom as an Atari entertainment system, and use their clout in the gaming industry in America as a way to get a foothold in. But Atari was being bought out by new management, and they were more focused on making what would eventually become the 7800, and the deal just never got made. A lot of people say that Atari turned them down. That wasn't really the case. It wasn't the top priority, and Nintendo just got tired of waiting and said, alright, we'll do it on our own. But how are we going to release a game console in a country that gaming is basically a taboo word? It's the kiss of death, because gaming is equated with all these failed consoles. Well, one thing you do is you don't call it a game console, you call it the entertainment system. And if you remember, back in the 80s, the one thing that pretty much everybody had was a VCR. So they designed the American entertainment system to have a slot like a VCR that pushed down, and it made it look like another item for your entertainment system that didn't scream game system. Because one thing about the 2600 and other game systems at the time is they were game systems. There was no doubt about it. And this, it could possibly pass off as just another part of your entertainment center. I mean, we know it's a game system now, but it was a different look. It was bold. It was big and bulky like VCRs were at the time. And that's how things got started. I mean, if you remember, Nintendo always called it the control deck. The games were game packs. They seemed to go out of their way to distance themselves and not use any verbiage other game companies used at the time, and it worked. I mean, if you're my age and younger, if you're in your 30 to 35, you didn't know anybody that didn't have a Nintendo unless they were like that weird kid whose parents didn't let them watch TV and have any fun. Anybody who was anybody had a Nintendo. Even the popular kids and the non-popular kids, and the nerds and the jocks. Everybody had at least one or two games for it, and that's how they got their foothold. I mean, it turned around the whole industry, and the reason why they were on top for at least another 10 years after that. Another thing that I picked up along with my Famicom is this little oddity here, the Famicom disk system, which, again, if you're my age group, you will recognize immediately as a floppy disk drive. It's not quite the same size as the 3 1/4. It's actually more like about 3 inches. This is the size of one of their discs. You'll notice there's no metal connector cover on here that a lot of floppy disks have. They use it as a cost-saving measure, which kind of blew up in their face because the discs are a lot more fragile because of that, although some did have a connector on it. Interesting story about it. The reason why Super Mario Brothers was such an awesome game was because at the time it was seen as the final send-off for game cartridges. They had limited size capacity at the time, and was pretty much seen as the end of the road. The costs were prohibitive to make them bigger as far as the memory capacity, and the reason why they made Super Mario Brothers so awesome is it was going to be the last hurrah for game carts, and they figured we'll send it off with a bang. So this, or I guess more accurately the Japanese Famicom version, this was seen as the grand goodbye for the age of game cartridges. But a funny thing happened. The disc system was released in 1986. Zelda was the first game that was released for it, because one of the advantages to the disc system is they could write to the disc and save games, which was unheard of concept at the time. And it was actually pretty popular in Japan. There was a couple of reasons why it never got released in America. A lot of people think it was because of the piracy aspect, and there was a lot of it. Anybody who remembers floppy disks back in the day, it was nothing too copy. You just buy a box of blank discs and there you go to town with it. There was some copy protection built into the disc system, but it wasn't anything that couldn't be overcome really easily. But the main reason why it didn't work is because, well, two things. One, the price of memory for cartridges, for the circuits for cartridges went down, and they were able to add more to it, so the capacity problem was solved. And two, they come up with a way to add a battery backup to game cartridges. So games like Metroid and Zelda that had a big selling point is you could save to it by writing on the floppy disk were released as cartridges in the US with a battery backup. So it kind of made the disk system redundant, but it did continue to be sold till I believe at least 1993. There's a lot of the new, what we call the NES 2, or the top loader with the AV Famicom in Japan. They actually made it flat on top so you could plug in the little RAM connector that the disk drive uses to plug into the console with the new one. So, and Nintendo actually supported it up until 2003. If you sent them a blank disc in 500 yen and asked them to send you a copy of a game, they would do it. And they only stopped servicing the disk drive as far as repairs whenever the parts became hard to find, and I guess the suppliers that make them anymore. But yeah, they stuck with it. It's if you go to Japan, go to a game store, it's fairly common to see disc games along with cartridges. You never see them here. If you look on eBay, you'll be lucky if you find a couple games. A lot of the import type stores will sell them. Some of the more rare ones can go for $70 with the manual and the box and all that. Even loose to go for $30. They're just not something you see a lot of around here. But the funny thing is, when they were designing the NES, even though it never came out here, they were thinking about it, because if you ever look at the bottom of your Nintendo, there is expansion port. Now, ideally, if anything ever came out to use it, there would probably be some way to remove this to add it on, but there was thoughts of adding some kind of add-on to the NES here, and just, the timing and technology finally catching up, it just wasn't needed anymore. So that was always an interesting little side note in history, that there is at least an idea of releasing something for it when the NES was first designed. So yeah, it's an interesting part of gaming history. I always recommend, if you can track one down for a decent price, it's always worth it to pick up a Famicom. They're just neat to have. Saves you having to get a converter to play games, because there are some games that never got released in the US. surprisingly, a lot of Japanese games like Super Mario Brothers and things like that are released mostly with English text. Also, it's a bit odd if you're a little kid in Japan and you're playing Super Mario and you get to the end boss, in like stage 4 or whatever, and it's the fake Bowser, and you get to the your princess is in another castle. Like, what if we were playing that as kids and it was in Japanese? But I don't know if, I guess the education system's better there. Maybe the kids know enough English to know what the text is. I always thought it was weird, but I guess that's gaming for you. Some things are universal, but if you ever find one somewhere, I recommend trying to find somebody domestically that has one. You can buy them for like $50, $60 from Japan, but then shipping is almost as much as the system itself. I don't know if it's legitimately that expensive to ship from Japan, or people are just trying to, I don't know, gouge is the right word, but it seems like sometimes the shipping charges you get from sellers in Japan, it's a little excessive, shall we say. You can buy game cartridges from people and it's only like $4, and suddenly the system, it's like $60 to ship. I mean, if you ever find one of these, they're not that heavy. I mean, they're light plastic. They're built to look like a toy. It's not like this thing is, like a Atari 2600 early model with, feels like there's a block of lead inside the system. It's very light, but yeah. All in all, it's a nice part of gaming history. It's a little bit of something not everybody knows about, or they know a little bit about it, but not a whole lot. And it's always an interesting thing to find out. A little aside here is when you boot up the disk system here, you get the little boot up song that plays. That if you ever look it up on YouTube, you can hear it. A little fanfare. And when Nintendo made the GameCube, which was the first disc-based system they've made since the disc system, that song that plays the background music for the GameCube menu, that's kind of like slow and trippy and like spacey sounding music, somebody actually sped that up and found out that it was the disk system boot up music slowed down like 16 times. So it's a interesting Nintendo-y type thing to do, that they're kind of a tip of the hat to their original disc-based system. So it's a fun thing to check out if you ever are able to. I'll probably put a link to it in the description below. But I guess I'll wrap that up for now, and I will see you guys later.